Good morning, or I guess for you guys, it's good evening. I'm delighted to be with you here today. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've been asked to talk about the legal status of necrophilia under U.S. law, and while that's a pretty disturbing topic, I think it's nonetheless an important topic. It's also timely, given the Indian court's recent decision reversing a rape conviction on the basis of the fact that the victim was dead at the time of the assault. So, of course, the case involved a 22-year-old man who murdered a 21-year-old woman and then engaged in sexual intercourse with her body after she was killed. He was convicted for murder under 302 of the Indian Penal Code and rape under 376 of the Indian Penal Code, and he appealed. The High Court upheld the murder conviction and the associated punishment, but invalidated his sentence for rape under 376, finding that 375 through 377 of the Indian Penal Code did not apply to the sexual assaults of dead people. So in invalidating the conviction, the court directed the central government to enact legislation criminalizing necrophilia. So they said, this is a gap in our laws. He can't be prosecuted for this, but this is behavior that should be prosecuted. So the central government needs to change the law. So in the future, people like this defendant can be subjected to criminal liability for necrophilic attacks. In addition, the court referenced reports of female bodies being subjected to necrophilia while in mortuaries and morgues, and directed the use of closed-circuit TV to monitor and apprehend perpetrators. The decision references the laws of the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, but not the United States. But that's probably because we don't have a law in the United States. We have 50 different laws. You may or may not know that our national legislature, Congress, does not have a general legislative mandate. Police powers are reserved to the states. The federal government, Congress, is only supposed to be legislating pursuant to enumerated powers. While Congress does occasionally pass criminal legislation, when they do, they justify it by reference to their authority under the Commerce Clause. That's sort of the constitutional hook they hang their hat on when they want to pass criminal laws. Most federal criminal laws have to do with drugs and guns. There is no federal law pertaining to necrophilia, but the states have laws. And that is typical. Most criminals are prosecuted at the state level. The feds prosecute relatively few of the criminals in this country. Okay, so what is necrophilia? Well, the word comes from the Greek, necros meaning dead, and philia meaning love or friendship. Webster's defines it as an abnormal attraction, especially an erotic attraction, to corpses. Joseph Guzlain was a Belgian pioneer in psychiatry, and he is credited with coining the term in the mid-1800s. His early work also laid the foundation for understanding necrophilia as a psychological or psychiatric disorder. So how do psychologists or psychiatrists define it, right? Well, how do they define necrophilia? Well, necrophilia is a type of paraphilia, and a paraphilia is a biomedical term used to describe intense sexual attraction, arousal, or urges, which are outside the range of usual sexual interests. Psychologists recognize sort of three classes of paraphilias, if you will. The first is a preference for non-human objects for sexual arousal. An example of this would be fetishists. So fetishes, of course, are sexual attraction to objects, and shoe fetishes are a common type of fetish. Second classification is repetitive sexual activity with humans that involves real or simulated suffering or humiliation. Sadism is an example of this type of paraphilia. And sadism, of course, is a situation where a person only experiences sexual arousal or gratification when inflicting pain on other people. So inflicting pain on others is sort of part of sex for them. The last category, repetitive sexual activity with non-consenting partners. This is the classification which necrophilia falls into. because obviously deceased people cannot give consent. All right, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, this is sort of the Bible for psychologists in this country. This is the manual they use for, it sets out the parameters when various diagnoses should be applied. The DSM-4, which was the previous one, classified necrophilia as a paraphilia of the not otherwise specified type. This is probably because necrophilia is pretty unusual. So it's not a paraphilia that occurs very frequently in a typical psychologist's practice. And it's sort of lumped into not other specified type. The more recent DSM, the current one, the DSM-5, classifies necrophilia as another specified paraphilic disorder involving recurrent and intense sexual interest in corpses. The change in terminology from paraphilia to paraphilic disorder was basically done to avoid pathologizing aberrant but not necessarily harmful sexual preferences. So in order to be considered pathological, it not only has to be paraphilic, so an intense and persistent sexual interest, other than that which is considered typical or normal, intimate activity with another consenting adult, but it also has to be a disorder. And to qualify for that, it has to be causing distress or impairment to the person who has it, or the paraphilia's satisfaction entails personal harm, or the risk of harming other people, in order to qualify as a pathological paraphilic disorder. The International Classification of Diseases, that's the World Health Organization's, very similar. They put necrophilia into the paraphilic disorders involving non-consenting individuals. Again, it's an intense pattern of atypical sexual arousal, and it's with people who are unwilling to consent or they're unable to consent. And then as an example, the ICD references necrophilia and bestiality, and then goes on to specifically exclude sexual behavior involving consenting adults, assuming the person's capable of providing consent, and with a deceased person, they cannot, obviously. There's long-standing social taboos associated with necrophilia. They date back to at least the ancient Egyptians. Herodotus reports that ancient Egyptians would delay sending a woman's body to the embalmers for several days in order to deter or discourage funerary workers from engaging in sexual contact with the deceased. In Victorian times, all sex not leading to procreation was regarded as unnatural, sinful, and wrong, and obviously necrophilia falls into that category. In more modern times, the principle of consent has become important to legitimate sexual activity, must involve consent. People should not be subjected to sexual activity they're not consenting to. Obviously, the deceased person can't consent. Most religions also posit that we go on after we die, that there's some form of continued existence after death. And indeed, funerary customs and funerary rituals across human societies are predicated on the notion that the deceased has not yet ceased to exist. I am Irish, that's my background, and Irish wakes date back to pre-Christian Ireland, and the reason why they would have a party is they believed you had to give the deceased a good send-off, show them that you loved them and you cared about them and you wanted them to move on, because if you didn't, they would hang around the village and cause butter not to churn, kill livestock, bring other forms of mischief to the village. So that's why they did these sort of parties. Even today, Irish people will have an Irish wake often after the funeral, and it involves food and sort of a party, really, where you celebrate the person's life. The belief in the continued existence of the person in some form is probably the basis for the deeply entrenched and pervasive abhorrence of necrophilia across human societies. I thought this quote really summed it up pretty well. Necrophilia is the ultimate social taboo, surpassing even cannibalism. so repulsive is the concept that it rarely appears as a crime on the statute books. And in the US, that's true. Only 3 states actually use the term necrophilia in their statutes. And many prosecute it as an abuse of a corpse or desecration of a corpse without any statutory reference to sex with the deceased, although they will prosecute necrophiles under those statutes. There are a few miscreants who want to normalize necrophilia. I came across the Necroerotic newsletter, a reference to it. That's a publication I didn't need to know existed, but it's apparently put out by a fringe group that's trying to normalize necrophilia. And there is some evidence that some people are actually attracted to the behavior because it's so taboo, because it's a way of sort of thumbing your nose at the most deeply entrenched societal values, and that is appealing to some people. Well, how much of this is occurring? How much necrophilia is going on? That is a tough question to answer, frankly. It's not systematically tracked in the US. It's not what we call a UCR offense. Uniform crime reports are sort of reportable offenses that are collated, and the FBI publishes the data annually. Necrophilia is not one of the crimes they're tracking. So it's not systematically tracked in this country, and I wasn't able to find any country doing that in a systematic way. So we don't have great data, frankly. Although there is some research that sheds some light on the quantification question. Stein and his colleagues did a study using the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit's data. They had 211 cases in their sample, and in that analysis, they found that 16 or almost 8% of the sexual homicide perpetrators engaged in necrophilia with the victim. Of that 16, all of them were male, most of them were white, although the US population is mostly white. Most of them were single. None of them had documented psychoses, and most had criminal histories, with rape and burglary being the most common prior offense for these people. Certainly, case studies of lust serial killers suggest necrophilia is not uncommon. Dahmer, Nilsen, Kemper, Lucas, Ridgway, many of the lust serial killers engaged in necrophile in addition to killing the person. Necrophilia in addition to killing the person. When you're talking about necrophilia that's not associated with a homicide, quantification may be even tougher to get a handle on, because when there is a dead body, there is some evidence that may bring the crime to the authorities' attention. But if the necrophilia is not associated with a homicide, the chances of the authorities finding out about the crime is probably reduced, right? We use the term dark figure of crime in this country to refer to crime that we don't know about. It's crime that that no one reported to the police, either because there is no victim or no victim who's capable of reporting. Obviously, with necrophilia, the deceased can't report. And it doesn't otherwise come to the attention of the authorities, right? We believe that necrophilia is probably more prevalent than is commonly assumed. And there is some evidence that it might be widespread. Morton's book, Apocalypse Culture, quotes Karen Greenlee, who was a mortician convicted of abducting a man's body. And she said many necrophilic activities in funeral homes go unnoticed, and even when discovered by funeral directors, are unlikely to be reported for fear of adverse publicity. No one who owns a funeral home wants the word to get out that that sort of thing might happen to your loved one if you allow them to handle the arrangements. And consequently, at least according to Greenlee, it doesn't get reported even when it is detected. Another source quoted an unidentified male mortician who said, "A hell of a lot of people would be into this if they had easy private access to fresh bodies. I suspect half the people who come into contact with corpses play with them. You can act out any fantasy with them." In connection with an investigation, a German man testified to having sex with a fresh corpse at a clandestine New York brothel. obviously that would suggest there's some demand if there's a brothel catering to that. More recently, a morgue worker in Ohio admitted to having sex with about 100 bodies awaiting autopsy prior to being caught. Time magazine reported that. So there is some anecdotal type evidence which suggests it may be more widespread than people think. There are 3 basic types of true necrophilia. This is based on Rosman and Resnick's work. There's homicidal necrophilia. That's where the person murders someone to obtain their corpse for sexual purposes. There's regular necrophilia, where the perpetrator uses an already dead body for sexual purposes. And then there's platonic necrophilia. These are people who just fantasize about necrophilic acts, but don't actually engage in them. Or people who gain sexual pleasure just from looking at the dead body, but don't touch it. You'll occasionally see a reference to pseudonecrophilia, which is defined as a transient attraction to corpses. An illustrative example was a man who murdered his wife, and during the course of hiding her body, he became aroused, he had anal intercourse with her, and then he continued to hide the body. He was caught, and he, according to him anyway, never had any interest in necrophilia before or after. So that would be a transient sexual attraction to corpses. Rosman's Resnick study was one of the early ones. It's from 1989, and there's very few studies, frankly, on this topic. But they had a sample of 122 people who had committed acts of necrophilia. They found most of them were regular necrophiles. And alarmingly, more than half of those people worked in the morgue or funeral industry so they would have access to victims. Over 90% of the true necrophiles in this study were male. And certainly that's consistent with what we know about necrophilia. It tends to be perpetrated by men. Although there was one woman in the study, she was a female embalmer, and she had rigged up a pump device for purposes of assaulting male corpses. Most necrophiliacs are heterosexual, but almost half of those who committed necrophilic homicide in this sample were homosexual. Agrawal proposed an even more elaborate classification system in 2008 with 10 different types of necrophilia being identified. The first class 1, was role players, and these are people who aren't actually interacting with dead bodies. They are role playing with another live person. Sometimes the sexual activity will occur with the person pretending to be dead in a coffin or casket. Other times, it's usually the woman will put white makeup on or take an ice bath to otherwise simulate being deceased. Romantic necrophiles are people who have lost a loved one, and they at least temporarily don't recognize that that person is dead. They can't accept it. So they continue to interact with that person as though they were alive in a variety of capacities, including sexual capacities, if that was one dimension to the relationship when the person was alive. Class 3 necrophiliacs are people who just have fantasies. They don't act on them, but they have fantasies about necrophilia. Class 4 are the first class that are actually having contact with a stranger's body. These people enjoy touching or licking dead people. There's no actual sex, though, with tactile necrophiliacs, although they are engaging with the body for purposes of sexual gratification. Class 5 necrophiliacs are fetishistic necrophiliacs, and these people will cut off part of the corpse and keep it for fetishistic purposes. Jerry Brudos, the shoe fetish slayer, cut off one of the feet of one of his victims, and he kept it in his freezer and then would use it to model shoes for fetishistic purposes. Class 6 necrophiliacs are people who engage in necromutilomania, which is the practice of obtaining sexual gratification by mutilating dead bodies. They're not engaging in conventional sexual activity, but they are obtaining sexual gratification by mutilating. Opportunistic necrophiles usually have sex with living people, but if an opportunity arises or living options become unavailable, they may engage in necrophilia. Regular necrophiles prefer and only want to have sexual intercourse with the dead, although they may have had sex with living people at some time or another. Homicidal necrophiles kill in order to have sex with the corpse. And then the last class, class 10, is exclusive necrophiles, and these people are incapable of performing sexually with living people. So that's the classification our rule came up with. Now, not all forms of necrophilia are subject to criminal sanctioning, obviously, especially if you're using the more extensive classification system. Platonic necrophilia and class 3 fantasists, no sanctionable activity occurs. There is no actus reus. So there is nothing to prosecute. It's all happening in the mind. Role players are generally not running afoul of the law either, as long as it's with another consenting person. Although possibly if it's non-consensual, in doing the research to get ready for this talk, I came across a case in Arizona where a man was prosecuted under their necrophilia statute for using his cell phone to videotape himself having sexual intercourse with his unresponsive girlfriend. So it may be possible in some circumstances that you'll get prosecuted. As I mentioned before, there is no federal law that applies to necrophilia, and the 50 states handle necrophilia in a variety of ways. Everything from no criminal liability at all to life with parole or possible sanctions, depending upon what state you commit the offense in. As is happening to India right now, you guys are confronting as a society the issue of what to do with necrophilia in the wake of Indian law doesn't cover it. Well, a number of states got their necrophilia laws the same way. A high-profile case came to the public's attention, and either the court or the prosecutor said, we can't do anything about this really, or they had to proceed under a much lower level type offense than most people think is warranted. And then consequently, the state legislature adopted a law that punished necrophilia. So I'm just using Rhode Island as an example. There are several states, quite a few. In Rhode Island, Charles Smith stabbed his stepdaughter to death and then had sex with her body. He thought she was dead anyway. The state charged him with murder and 2 counts of sexual assault in the first degree. At his trial, the medical examiner testified that they couldn't be sure. They didn't know definitively whether the victim was alive or dead at the time of the sexual assault. And because of this uncertainty, the trial court granted Smith's motion for a judgment of acquittal on the sexual assault charges. Public outrage resulted in the swift passage of a law providing that performing an act of first-degree sexual assault upon a dead body is the crime of necrophilia, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. The actus reus to first-degree sexual assault in Rhode Island does require sexual penetration, but penetration is defined pretty broadly. It includes a variety of body parts and even objects. So obviously the most alarming type of necrophilia, the type that is the most dangerous, is necrophilic homicide or class 4 necrophiles, right? It's not uncommon among hedonistic lust serial killers, as I mentioned before. Many of them are motivated to kill in order to obtain a non-resisting, non-rejecting sex partner. That's what Jeffrey Dahmer said he was doing. That he was primarily motivated by a desire to satisfy his paraphilic interest in necrophilia. Lust killers are almost always male, as far as we know. Females who have been involved in these sort of cases, at least the ones that have come to our attention, are involved with a man. They're part of a killing team, usually involving a man who appears to be the dominant partner and is driving the criminal activity. Sadists and other thrill killers sometimes accidentally have sex with the body post-mortem, so they're in a frenzy, they're assaulting the person, and maybe they don't realize the person is already dead. They killed them sort of faster than they had intended to. So it's accidental in that sense, but not accidental. They intended to assault the person. Okay, escalation can occur. Sometimes people start off as grave robbers, so they start off having contact with already deceased people, and then they move on to killing in order to get fresh corpses on the timetable they want them. Ed Gein is an example of this. He started off grave robbing for corpses, and then he moved on to killing women to get fresh corpses. His last victim, you can see there, she's hanging upside down by her ankles. She was field dressed like a deer. The object with a tag on it was something he made using a victim's skin. A number of articles around the house were found to be made from women's body parts. A typical homicidal necrophiliac is someone like Dennis Nilsen. He's sometimes referred to as the British Jeffrey Dahmer. He was motivated by a desire for company. He was lonely, socially awkward, very socially isolated, and he was motivated to kill in order to have bodies around the house as company. He strangled his first victim, apparently spontaneously, the morning after a one-night stand when he realized his new friend was going to be leaving. His MO was to pick up victims at pubs, bring them home, render them unconscious with alcohol, and then strangle them. He would put their bodies under the floorboards, and he would take them out, he would give them baths, he would dress them, he would interact with them in a variety of ways. He would also interact with them sexually. He would put them in his bed and would get in bed next to them and masturbate. But he would do things like watch TV with them, prop them up in a chair, and he was killing out of loneliness. He would talk to the cadavers. He said that he got a sense of company from having body parts around the house. He was caught because in 1983, he tried to flush human remains down the toilet, and he clogged up the plumbing for his apartment building. So someone called a plumber, the plumber came, found out what was clogging the pipes with human remains, and alerted the authorities. And then Dennis was identified and apprehended. All right, so I want to talk about the legal treatment of necrophilia cases involving killing the victim under U.S. law. These are typically either necrophilic homicide cases or perimortem rape cases. Okay, so necrophilic homicide in states with the death penalty. They may not charge the necrophilia as a separate offense. They may use it to prove up the applicability of the death penalty to you. So about half of the states in the United States still use the death penalty, and the federal government still has the death penalty as well. So in death penalty states, evidence of necrophilia might be used to establish an aggravating circumstance rather than being charged as a separate crime. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the death penalty in the U.S., so I'll give you a quick thumbnail sketch. The death penalty was abrogated in the Furman decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. In Furman, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the death penalty was being applied in such an arbitrary and capricious manner that it violated due process, that you can't just sort of, willy-nilly apply the death penalty to some people, not others, with no real rhyme or reason to it. It's arbitrary and capricious and a violation of due process. So they invalidated Georgia's death penalty statute. The Georgia legislature went back to the drawing board and drafted a new statute aimed at channeling discretion. That statute came up to the Supreme Court in the Gregg decision. And in Gregg, the Supreme Court said, okay, this death penalty statute satisfies due process. It passes constitutional muster, if you will, because the discretion is being adequately channeled. Most states, in fact, pretty much all of them, that retained penalty basically copied Georgia's statute so that they would know their statute was also going to comport with the Constitution. So I'll tell you briefly what the procedure is. In death cases, we have a bifurcated trial. So first, the trier of fact, either the judge or the jury, finds the defendant guilty or not guilty. If they are found guilty, it proceeds to the second stage, the punishment stage. And this is where evidence relevant to whether or not this person is deserving of the death penalty is used. The state must prove one statutory aggravating circumstance beyond a reasonable doubt. So the statutes list a bunch of aggravating circumstances. Happened in the course of another felony. You have a prior serious assaultive conviction in the past. There's a bunch of different ones, anywhere from 12 to about 18, depending on the state. Most states have an aggravator like this one. This is Missouri's. Other states have something using similar verbiage. Some of them use heinousness in there, but this is a statutory aggravator. The government would have to prove that the murder in the first degree was outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible, or inhumane, and that it involved torture or depravity of mind. Okay, with that aggravator, in determining whether the murder was committed in a heinous or depraved manner, reviewing courts will consider the following. Did the defendant relish the murder? Did they inflict gratuitous violence on the victim? Did they mutilate the victim? Was the crime particularly senseless? Was the victim helpless? In reviewing whether or not evidence of necrophilia was sufficient to establish an aggravating circumstance, the Arizona Supreme Court said a defendant's act of necrophilia, without question, constitutes the infliction of gratuitous violence on the victim. Thus, it justifies imposition of the death penalty. The other type of cases where this comes up, perimortem rape cases, these are cases where the rape occurs at or near the time of death. Some defendants have attempted to raise a necrophilia defense when they have killed their rape victim. Most jurisdictions have rejected it, some by statute. The Wisconsin Comprehensive Sexual Assault Law basically says this section applies whether a victim is dead or alive at the time of the sexual contact or sexual intercourse. Other jurisdictions have done it by court decision. My own state of Missouri, in the McLaughlin decision, said, as have the majority of jurisdictions to address this issue. This court adopts the ongoing criminal assault rule. Under that rule, where the forcible compulsion that leads to the rape begins before the death of the victim, the defendant is guilty of rape, even if the jury believes the defendant killed the victim before penetration occurred or before the sexual assault was concluded. They went on to say reading the live-only requirement into the rape statute basically encourages rapists to kill their victims. A minority of states do permit the necrophilia defense, however. California and Nevada, their states with specific necrophilia laws, have limited rape convictions to offenders who have violated a living person. These states reason more or less that a corpse isn't living, and therefore it's legally impossible to rape a corpse. California will, however, allow a conviction for attempted rape if the defendant thought the victim was alive when he initially attempted to have intercourse. You can also charge murder and necrophilia as separate offenses if you're in a jurisdiction with a necrophilia law. Obviously, how that's going to be prosecuted depends in part on how the state treats regular necrophilia. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a brief summary of how sort of necrophilia statutes that don't require the death of the victim. These would be cases where the sexual activities involving someone who was already deceased and the person engaging in the behavior had nothing to do with that person's death. It's criminal in most places in the United States. 46 states criminalize necrophilia. 31 states treat it as a felony. In the United States, felonies, you can get more than a year in prison. With misdemeanors, it's a year or less. 15 states treat necrophilia as a misdemeanor, while the majority treat it as a felony. Among states that criminalize it, though, they don't all use the same approach. The three main approaches used are criminalizing necrophilia as a crime against nature. Other states criminalize it as an abuse or desecration of the corpse. and other states treat it as a sex offense. So the first approach, crimes against nature, sometimes called CAN laws. The rationale for these laws is the societal revulsion and disgust of the activity in question. So it's just based on the idea that this is behavior that should not occur. And that's why it's criminalized. These tend to be broad acts that target unconventional, deviant, or perverted sex acts. They are often vaguely worded. They were formerly used to target homosexuals. They punished consensual sodomy, which allowed the state to go after people who are engaging in same-sex intimate relations. After the Lawrence decision in 2003, CAN laws could no longer be used against homosexuals in this country. The Lawrence decision invalidated the use of CAN laws against homosexuals, finding that adults have a substantive due process privacy right under the 14th Amendment to engage in intimate relations with other consenting adults. Today, CAN laws are still used to prosecute primarily necrophilia and bestiality, sometimes pedophilia, although most jurisdictions have a separate statute regarding pedophilia. Idaho is an example of a state that criminalizes necrophilia as a crime against nature. The Idaho statute says every person who is guilty of the infamous crime against nature committed with mankind or any animal is punishable by imprisonment of not less than 5 years. CAN laws are sometimes criticized because people say they're based on emotionality and just sort of disapproval, which is an illegitimate basis for coercive law. There should be a more concrete interest at stake before something is criminalized. Abuse or desecration of corpse laws are predicated on the rationale that society needs to protect the family and the wider society's sensibilities from outrage and upset and horror over that happening to their loved one. Most of these statutes don't specifically prohibit sex with a corpse, but acts of necrophilia are regarded as an act of abuse or desecration. So necrophilia is a type of corpse abuse or desecration. Some states specifically prohibit mutilating or unauthorized dissection. This, of course, would apply to Class 6 necromutilomaniacs, people who get sexual gratification off mutilating corpses. The states that use this approach are split about 50-50 on whether or not it's a misdemeanor or a felony. The Model Penal Code handles necrophilia as an abuse of corpse, and here is the Model Penal Code handling of this offense. They put necrophilia in the chapter on offenses against public order and decency, so they don't treat it as a sex offense. And it's in the provision that covers riots, disorderly conduct, and related offenses. The provision abuse of a corpse says, except as otherwise authorized by law, a person who treats a corpse in a way that he knows would outrage ordinary family sensibilities commits a misdemeanor. The comments to this provision of the Model Penal Code specifically mentions necrophilia as an example of prohibited abuse. More states actually treat it as a sex crime. 8 states treat necrophilia as a type of sex crime. The rationale there, of course, is the deceased person cannot consent to sex, and therefore it's illegitimate, illegal, improper. And or they focus on it being a violation of the deceased person's sexual autonomy. These statutes require sex with her corpse or other contact for purposes of sexual gratification as an element of the offense. Washington's revised code is an example. Any person who has sexual intercourse or sexual contact with a dead human body is prosecutable under their necrophilia law. They may or may not use the necrophilia terminology. Most states actually don't. They will just refer to sex with the body or sexual contact. Some states require people convicted under their necrophilia act to register as a sex offender. Nevada, Washington, and Iowa all do that. I don't know if you're familiar with the U.S.'s sexual offender registry laws, but every state has a an offender registry. And what happens if you're convicted or plead guilty to certain sex offenses, you are required to register. This is a publicly available registry. People can get online and search it to see if there are offenders living in their neighborhood or working with them. They're required to disclose their residential address as well as their work address. And the registry gives a brief summary of the type of crime the person was convicted of. And these are public record, and most states require you to register for life, although with some lower level offenses, you can get off the registry in some states after a period of time if you don't get into trouble again. So that's a pretty big additional sanction, because that's going to follow you around for the rest of your life if you're required to register. States that treat necrophilia as a sex crime usually treat it as a lesser sexual offense unless it's associated with a homicide. So sexual assault in the 4th degree, sexual misconduct, something like that, it's not treated as a forcible sex offense. There is extreme sanction variability among the states that treat necrophilia as a sex offense. In Alaska and North Dakota, it's a misdemeanor and a person can get a year or less in prison. In Florida, you can get up to 15 years in prison, and Nevada will give you life with parole, or potentially can give you life with parole for a necrophilia conviction. A few states don't criminalize it at all. 4 states, Louisiana, Missouri where I live, Nebraska, and New Mexico, and DC, have no specific necrophilia statutes. Civil remedies might be available in those jurisdictions, but there's not a criminal law aimed at curbing that behavior. I mean, it's possible that the state legislature has thought about it and has decided not to criminalize necrophilia. Usually the argument is something along the lines of deceased people aren't persons, and a person's liberty should not be interfered with unless their conduct hurts someone else. And a deceased person is no longer a person. That would be that argument. It's unlikely that's what happened, especially given the states, Missouri, Nebraska, Louisiana are very conservative states. It's a lot more likely that the statutory silence isn't signaling endorsement at all. It's just the issue hasn't come up in the state yet. As I mentioned earlier, states often adopt necrophilia laws after a high-profile case comes to light. And so it's more likely that a case just hasn't come to light where the prosecutor or the court said they can't be charged. Here are 2 more examples of states that's how they ended up with a necrophilia law. Washington, Ronald Shawn Ryan repeatedly broke into a funeral home and had sexual contact with dead women's bodies. The prosecutor had to proceed on a burglary charge because there was no applicable statute. In California, a little girl was sexually assaulted by the driver assigned to transport her body to the morgue. His assault was caught on a security camera. As you might imagine, it caused a lot of public outrage, and the prosecutors had to proceed under the health and safety code, which was, very minor type of liability. In both of these states, the legislatures moved swiftly to criminalize necrophilia in the wake of these cases. Okay, so assuming necrophilia is criminalized, the next question is, what would be the potential defenses? Well, not guilty by reason of insanity is obviously a logical defense that might be raised to a charge of necrophilia, given its pathological character. In the United States, not guilty by reason of insanity varies by state. So the McNaughton rule, or a derivative thereof, sometimes shorthanded as the right-wrong test, is the most common. That approach says if a defendant is laboring under a defect of reason from a disease of the mind such that they don't know the nature or quality of their action, or if they do, they don't know what they're doing is wrong, the person can be acquitted based on a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. There are other formulations that make it easier for defendants to satisfy their burden of proof. Insanity is an affirmative defense, and in many jurisdictions, not just preponderance, but clear and convincing evidence is required to prevail on that affirmative defense. So some of these easier formulations, the irresistible impulse, basically says that if the person is suffering from an irresistible impulse that stops them from being able to stop themselves from committing an act they know is wrong, they can establish that they are eligible for not guilty by reason of insanity. The substantial capacity test, at least the first part, focuses on wrongfulness, as does McNaughton, but here the defendant just has to show they lack substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality, or to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. And the Durham rule is probably the easiest. It would allow a not guilty by reason of insanity acquittal if the defendant convinces the trier of fact that the unlawful act was the product of a mental disease or defect. In India, you handle insanity defenses under the rubric of unsound mind. Section 84 of the Indian Penal Code is basically a McNaughton derivative. Nothing in the offense, nothing is an offense if it's done by a person who at the time of doing it, by reason of unsoundness of mind, incapable of knowing the nature of the act, or that he is doing what is either wrong or contrary to law. So that would be pretty similar to U.S. jurisdictions that follow a McNaughton-type rule. Most necrophiliacs do not qualify as legally insane. They may be mentally ill. Psychologists will diagnose them as having a paraphilic disorder, right? But that doesn't mean they're insane. Insanity is a legal concept, of course. And efforts to conceal the crime makes it very difficult to prove the defendant didn't know the nature of his act, or that what he was doing was wrong, right? So, and many necrophiliacs do that. So it's difficult for them to establish insanity. The insanity defense is probably most applicable to necrophiliacs who are psychotic. Psychosis is characterized by delusions, hallucination, thought disorders, and an impaired relationship with reality. They don't perceive or understand reality. A type of necrophiliac that is often psychotic is romantic necrophiliacs. These are people who are laboring under the delusion that their loved one is not dead, that they continue to be alive. And many of these people do qualify as psychotic, and psychotics can normally avail themselves of the not guilty by reason of insanity defense. Probably the most famous romantic necrophiliac in the United States is Count Karl von Kassel. And Karl worked at a tuberculosis hospital where he met Elena. She was one of his patients. He fell in love with her. He tried to save her. He was unsuccessful. She died. She was then buried in a mausoleum paid for by von Kassel. A couple years later, he moved her body to his house, and he restored her body. He removed the rotting flesh and replaced it with a combination of silk and wax. He used wire to kind of hold her together, and he replaced her eyes. He lived with what was left of her remains for 7 years. Her sister eventually found out and alerted the authorities. Karl was probably psychotic. He reports that when he went to the mausoleum to visit Elena, she would appear to him. They would talk. He said that she repeatedly asked him to take her out of her grave and bring her to his home, and that he was just doing what she wanted. He also rigged up a telephone type device so that he could talk to her when he wasn't able to be there, so she wouldn't be lonely. He was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. He did not need to raise the not guilty by reason of insanity defense, so he never did. We don't know how the jury would have ruled, because the judge cut him loose because the statute of limitations for the offense had already expired, so they couldn't try it. It became a bit of a cause celeb for reasons that, sort of escape me, but her body was put on display at a local funeral home in Key West, and over 6,000 people came to view it. Ed Gein is an example of someone who was able to successfully use a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. He was charged with murder, but he was acquitted on that basis. That is a picture of Ed with his mother. Well, they're not together, but his mother is the woman. She was domineering and puritanical and very controlling. Nonetheless, he was sort of devoted to her. He was devastated by her loss. He really didn't know how to function without her. And he began taking newly dead women's body parts in an effort to make a replica of Mom. And he eventually started killing women, at least 2. He made various objects out of these women's body parts, including a skin suit that he would wear. He also engaged in necrophilia with the corpses, and he was found not guilty by reason of insanity due to sort of the delusional nature of his, continued relationship with the mother. Okay, so let's look at the Indian court recommendations. They suggested that the central government amend Section 377, which is the unnatural offenses provision, to include dead bodies. So instead of just saying any man, woman, or animal, you just need to add language saying, someone who is deceased as well. Or the court alternatively said they could adopt new provisions criminalizing necrophilia, and the court also mentioned sadism, though that's a different phenomenon. The court also recommended a specific punishment range. They suggested punishable with imprisonment for life for a term up to 10 years. So in terms of the most analogous U.S. statutes that might be of use in considering what India should do to address the crime in India, I'm going to just show you the statutes that seem more closely aligned with the court's recommendations. So the Nevada statute, which treats necrophilia as a sex offense, is the closest to the suggested punishment range of the Indian court. In Nevada, they define necrophilia as sexual penetration of a dead body of a human being, and it's a Category A felony. That's a top-level felony. So they treat it as a very serious offense with a possible punishment of imprisonment for life with the possibility of parole, although you have to serve at least 5 years before you're eligible for parole. Much of the court's verbiage, though, when you read the decision, references upholding the dignity of the deceased. And that's a lot closer to the rationale used in our abuse and desecration statute. So I pulled up 2 states that they both followed the model penal code, as you can tell. And they basically criminalized the same conduct, treating a body in a way that will outrage ordinary family sensibilities, but they punish it very differently. In Alabama, it's a Class C felony, and you can get up to 10 years in prison for it. In Hawaii, it is treated as a misdemeanor, which means you can get no more than a year. You can get up to a year. So those are sort of the approaches that might be useful in considering as you think about the court's recommendations of what India should do to address the crime of necrophilia. The court also went on and made other recommendations, specifically the installation of closed-circuit TV cameras in mortuaries in all government and private hospitals within 6 months of receipt of the order. Given the evidence that it may be occurring in that context, that's probably a recommendation that is not off the mark and may be helpful. I was not able to find any laws in the U.S. mandating it, but there certainly are security cameras, at least in some mortuaries. Obviously, in California, that's how they caught the guy who assaulted that little girl. The decision also directs the government to maintain mortuary hygiene, secure information, especially information about cases that are stigmatized or socially criticized. They reference suicides and people who die of HIV. They also talk about assuring that the premises are private, that visitors and the general public don't have sight lines with the deceased, and the removal of barriers that might prevent living up to the Indian public health standard guidelines, and then they call for more staff training in proper ways of handling the deceased. Many of these are handled as regulatory matters in the U.S. as well and are subject to state regulation. Okay, so necrophilia subject of a law across all known human societies, but it's not always codified, and it's not always codified consistently in the modern world. There is no federal statute, and there is extreme variation in the treatment of necrophilia across the 50 states. So that's my summary of how necrophilia is treated in the United States. Are there any questions, comments, thoughts, etc.? Let me get a look at you. Okay. Okay, so how do you want me to handle this? Do people just want to talk to me, or do you want me to open this queue and call on people, or what do you want me to do?
Ma'am, according to your wish.
Okay, let's see if people, okay, I'll just acknowledge people who are on the list and they can ask questions. Okay, and I'm going to apologize up front. I am probably going to be terrible at pronouncing your names. I apologize. Arushi Lunia. I think you're on my queue for questions, maybe not. Maybe people should just speak up if they want to ask a question. Maybe that would be easier.
Hi. I think you're reading out the names of people in the list of contributors. I think a couple of other people have raised their hands, and that's like a separate.
Oh, okay, sure, we can do that. I am not familiar with this interface, as you have probably figured out. I don't teach online. I don't like the virtual world, so this is kind of a stretch for me. So I apologize. Let me see if I can do better. Okay, Sayak Ray.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, if you don't mind, I'll put 4 more minute question to you.
Please.
Ma'am, do you feel the definition, the normal definition of necrophilia, to which there are various scopes? The thing that needs to be changed is the definition. Because, ma'am, you refer to a particular case where the man basically lost at the grievance of the death of his mother, collected the parts of dead bodies of other women, and used to make various stuffs relating to his mother because of that. And previously, you referred to cases which is basically people using the bodies for the sexual gratification. So, ma'am, at the first place, do you feel that the very definition of necrophilia to include a lot more offences pertaining to a dead body should be taken into account?
Well, I mean, certainly abuse of corpses and the desecration statutes are aimed at covering a lot more than just sexual exploitation. Although I do think necrophilia, it is, and probably properly so, is limited to acts that have a sexual component of some kind. And of course, if you look at the classification, that's pretty broad, right? So sexual gratification obtained in various ways with a nexus to the corpse would be punishable. Although other things are punishable as abuse or desecration as well. It's just not called necrophilia. Does that answer your question?
This one, thank you so much.
Thanks for your question. Mega.
Yes, ma'am. Basically, I really wanted to ask something that since necrophilia, you said, is very common among people working in a morgue, especially before autopsy. So, does this change the results of an autopsy? And is changing the results a crime? Considering you told us about the various approaches that you can go through to criminalize necrophilia, can this be one of the approaches?
Yeah, in fact, the guy in Ohio, that's how he was caught. During one of the autopsies, they found sperm, and they had no reason to think that she had been sexually assaulted, and did not expect to find that in that autopsy. So then they started asking questions, and then they were able to figure out by doing some DNA testing whose it was, right? And so, yes, while the data suggested that a lot of necrophiles work in the funerary industry, I wouldn't say most people working in the funeral industry have that inclination. The data was referring, the data that said over half, that was referring to over half of the necrophiles in the study chose to work in the funeral industry because they wanted to have access to dead bodies. I don't want to suggest that everyone working in the funeral industry is nefariously motivated. But certainly that is an area where abuse is possible. And given, at least with private mortuaries, there is sort of an incentive to keep that under wraps, even if it comes to attention. Now, at the public morgue in Ohio, it was the city's morgue. When the coroner found the evidence, of course, that they pursued it because there's not the same, sort of business motive to keep it quiet. But yes, I do think that that industry probably warrants extra scrutiny, and so the court's suggestion that, well, I guess it's really an order, the mandate that they use closed circuit TV going forward probably will deter and help identify people engaging in that sort of behavior. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Swagata?
Hi, am I audible?
Hello.
Yeah, so I had a question regarding funerary proceedings. So in India, a large part of the population is like Hindu or Buddhist, etc., where your funerary proceedings are primarily cremation. Do you think the law needs to accommodate for that at all, or do you think the focus in India needs to be different than in the US because, burial and therefore keeping the body in the morgue for a very long time is not really something that happens outside of medical setups?
Okay, yeah, and I do think some states have dealt with that. For example, I didn't copy the provisions in the Hawaiian law, which exempted traditional Hawaiian burial practices from prosecution under their abuse of a corpse statute, because it wasn't relevant to what we were talking about. But you could certainly accommodate the religious preferences of various groups by simply expressly exempting them, saying if the body is treated in accordance with traditional Hindu customs or traditional Muslim customs or whatever it is, you could do that. That would be one way of doing it. Obviously, it would be important to make sure you craft the law so you're not punishing people who are just engaged in a good faith exercise of their religion. Although I think you can do that with a specific exemption saying if you're doing it in accordance with your, religious beliefs, then it's okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands, but let me see if I can, because I'm only seeing a small subset of the people. I don't know how to move this where I can see everybody.
I had a question too.
Great.
Am I audible? Hello.
Excuse me, I didn't catch that.
I'm sorry. Am I audible? Am I clearly audible?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
All right. Firstly, thank you so much for the presentation. It was actually really insightful and quite interesting. I had one question. I had a question for you, which sort of, if I can draw a parallel actually, with consent given by individuals for organ donation and research the consent's given before death, obviously, and organ donation and research is conducted post death of the individual. So drawing a parallel with this, if someone does give consent before death, does that remain valid? Especially in India, if let's say we are regulated by the rape laws in India, and obviously consensually, if somebody does have sexual intercourse, it is not rape. So if such consent is acquired before the death of the person, would that then be considered an illegal act post-death?
I'm not sure whether you're asking me if they consent to sex with the person while they're alive or whether they consented to having necrophilic acts performed on them after death. What type of pre-mortem consent are you talking about?
I'm talking about consent given by a person for necrophilic acts done to them after their death.
Okay, wow, like that's really an interesting question. I did not see any cases like that, but that's an interesting question. I think if the jurisdiction treated it like a sex offense, consent would be a defense, right? So, because consent is a defense to sex offenses. Less clear, it would be a defense to abuse of the corpse or desecration of the corpse, although many of those, because those statutes don't say your family would be outraged, what they say is normal family sensibilities, which would probably be gauged by reference to the majority of the population, right? So I'm not sure pre-mortem consent would be a defense if it was an abuse or a desecration, and it certainly wouldn't be a defense to a CAN law, a crimes against nature law, because they are trying to prohibit people from engaging in that sexual conduct sort of irrespective of consent, right? Because certainly when it was used against homosexuals, it was used against people where everyone was consenting, right? So I think it would depend the type of law India chose to adopt. If they chose to adopt something that was more like the unnatural offenses, that's kind of a CAN law. So if they amended 377, I'm not sure consent would be a defense. But if they adopted a separate sex offense statute, I could at least see a decent argument that would be a defense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for asking. I can only see like a dozen of you, and I don't know how to see more of you. So if other people have questions, why don't we just start talking?
I would like to point out there is a question in the chat box, so may I read it out for
Sure,
your
please.
convenience? Okay. So Rudraksh Chaudhary has asked, ma'am, is necrophilia exclusive to men or is it common among other genders as well?
Most of the data and research, at least right now, suggests it's primarily men. There was the one female embalmer that I referenced in the study. So I'm not saying it's exclusively men, but it does look like it is primarily committed by men. Now it's possible that females, especially those in the funerary industry, are engaging in it, and perhaps what they're doing is leaving less evidence behind, so they're less likely to be caught. I mean, that's certainly possible. We don't know what we don't know, right? But I would say right now, the evidence seems to suggest that the majority, and the vast majority of people who are engaging in this kind of behavior are men.
Thank you. I have a question myself, if I may.
Sure.
You had stated that in a study it was seen about half of the people, or at least half of the people who were engaged in necrophilia, were workers in the mortuary. So that can be a factor for the low female involvement in the act of necrophilia, because especially in countries like India, males are more involved or more engaged, we can say, in the mortuary and that industry. So what are the other factors behind low female involvement in the act of necrophilia? What is your take on that?
I mean, women tend to not be involved in sex crimes, period, right? And if you're talking about interpersonal crimes of violence, female participation is much lower than males, at least in my country. Women who get involved in the criminal justice system are much more likely to be there as a result of a property crime, selling drugs, bad checks, things like that, perhaps prostitution, but are less likely to be involved because they committed a violent crime. And violent crimes, parallel to necrophilia, involve actual interaction with the other person's body, violations of the other person's bodily integrity. So it may just be that women, for reasons we quite don't understand, are just less inclined to engage in that sort of behavior. And so they're not doing necrophilia either. and I don't think we totally understand why women are less involved in crime. Frida Adler suggests the liberation hypothesis. As women achieve equality in other realms, we'll start to see women's crime rates and types of crime looking more like men's. She was writing in the 70s, while women's participation, at least in the criminal justice system in my country as offenders, has increased, and they're a bigger proportion of the population of prisoners than they used to be, they are still a significant minority, much less so than men.
Thank you.
Malabika?
Yes, ma'am. Hello. Hi. Thank you for the presentation, ma'am. It was really wonderful. I had a question. So, if you are aware, I mean, I joined the lecture late. I probably this wouldn't have been covered. I do not know. So, with respect to Aghori Babas, so this is a sect of religious worshippers or that present in India. They do this concept of necrophilia as a part of their rituals. So it is opposed by majority Hindu worshippers, but they involved in certain activities like using the bones as jewelry and using having sexual acts with the bodies, considering this as a purification or a form of purification of soul or a devotion as such. So, with regarding to the study that you have conducted, have you come across anything that probably might shield them from a punishment that we might legislatively create? Or yes, or
Yeah,
have you come
I
across
did
any
not do a
instances?
study. I reported other people's studies. I haven't done
No,
any.
have you come across any study which has reported their work or any instances in other cultures where they involved in such kind of religious activity involving necrophilia?
Well, I do know the statute in Hawaii specifically exempts traditional Hawaiian cultural practices from prosecution under their abuse of corpse statute. So, I mean, it would be possible for India to do the same. They could have a provision that saying, here's the law, and then have a sub-provision saying, activities conducted in accordance with either the religious beliefs generically or identify the particular group. Like in Hawaii, they said traditional Hawaiian cultural practices. So they identified who they were trying to protect from prosecution. So they could definitely do that. And I have to say, I am unfamiliar with this group you're talking about. And I don't believe there are any religious groups in the United States, at least not none that are big enough that I'm aware of them, that necrophilia is part of their religious practice. But you certainly could exempt them as Hawaii did. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Does anyone else have a question?
No further questions are seen in the chat box as well. I think you can continue.
Okay, so does anybody else have a question that they'd like to talk about, or are we done?
I feel that's it for today's session, ma'am. I can't even put into words how insightful that was for us, especially for me because this is a topic that particularly interests me. We have had a conversation before when we had you over at NUJS last year, and we both shared that discussion where we discussed several kinds of serial killers, if I may. And this is something that really, really interested both of us, and we literally geeked out for them. And I couldn't thank you enough for taking out time at such early morning in your time for us.
No problem at all.
Thank you
so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me. I always really enjoy interacting with NUJS students. You guys are so smart, so engaged. I wish my students did my reading, my reading assignments like you guys. You guys were very good at the conference and also today. Great questions, really great questions.
Ma'am, the pleasure is ours. Pleasure is ours.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And ma'am, for vote of thanks, I'd like to invite Arpita. She's our first year student, and she'd like to proceed with the vote of thanks.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I'm there. Thank you, ma'am. Once again, as our convener Raghav had stated, thank you so much for this insightful session because as law students, we have to be aware, we can say, of the contemporary issues that are going on, and necrophilia is an emerging issue. And we are at a juncture where this country needs to have provisions to criminalize such a heinous act. So, thank you for providing such an insightful session regarding this. We could get an in-depth explanation regarding the types of necrophilia, regarding the act, and we were exposed to different ways in which different states have incorporated legal provisions in order to combat this act. So, thank you so much for your cooperation, for your valuable insight into this topic, and thank you so much to the rest of the participants as well for being so patient, for being good listeners, and for giving good questions and being attentive. And here's to having more sessions in the future with you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, ma'am.
Great talking to you. Bye bye.